what you should be doing is, look, you should have that. Turn around. You carry the front of the procession.
I have no idea if this was Gordon's idea or whether he was told to do this bit, but please never change Gordon, this was such television gold. Joe does what I think is supposed to be a British accent, which somehow ends up being worse than Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins.
I can hear him now.
Is the onion soup supposed to be so goddamn bloody good?
Well, not Royal Academy, I suppose. Still, they're better than a finger in the eye, ain't they?
Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. So a lot of you seem to enjoy my Kitchen Nightmares video, and someone suggested that I should go through some episodes of Kitchen Nightmares and do a sort of review with my thoughts about the episode, so here you go. I thought I would start with one of the most confrontational episodes that I've ever seen of Kitchen Nightmares, and it was so dramatic that the episode was actually split into 2 parts. And no, I'm not talking about Crazy Amy, I'm saving that for another video. What I am talking about is Joe from Mill Street Bistro, and Joe has to be one of the most frustrating but also memorable owners that we've ever seen on the show. And this felt like the perfect choice for my first review video. So this is part 1 of Mill Street Bistro from Kitchen Nightmares. We start the episode in the rural countryside town of Norwalk, Ohio, where we meet restaurateur and all-around cool guy on a motorbike, Joe Nagy, who decided in his infinite wisdom that after he lost his job in food sales, the best idea would be to buy a livestock ranch and open a fine dining restaurant in a small rural city. And the restaurant is called Mill Street Bistro. Within the first 30 seconds of the episode, they make it pretty clear that Joe has a pretty high opinion of himself, to say the least.
I was trained and worked for many old school chefs that were Europeans.
Joe also thinks that the word fine dining is obnoxious, even though he ends up using it quite a lot throughout the episode. Pretty quickly we find out that Joe's staff seem to have had enough of his nonsense, and they tell us straight away that Joe is delusional and that the restaurant is, quote, mediocre at best. Joe also says that they are farm to fork because they get the meat from his ranch, and let's just put a pin in that for now because that becomes an important detail later in the episode. We then hear from Tom, the cook, who's kind of like the good cop versus Joe's bad cop, and Tom actually seems to know what he's doing, but isn't given much free rein in the kitchen. And Tom wastes absolutely no time by throwing Joe under the bus.
He's always playing up the quality of the food. Most of our stuff is frozen.
And then they cut to a shot of Joe telling customers how everything is so great and homemade.
We made that sauce from scratch.
Which is the first example of the editors really gunning for Joe in this episode, and I'm totally here for it. But one of the most brutal but honest lines comes from Rebecca, the server.
When I think about Joe, I think of an arrogant, selfish jerk.
Which does seem harsh, but then Joe also says this.
I know that Tommy and me are handsome guys. Don't come back here and stare at us.
And I can't tell if Joe is actually as arrogant as he seems, or whether he's been totally set up by the editing. This is reality TV after all, and the show is called Kitchen Nightmares, not Kitchen Dreams. Joe then says that despite the name of the show, his restaurant is not a kitchen nightmare because of cleanliness or functionality, but rather because they don't have butts on seats at the restaurant. And that's when we see our favourite hot-tempered British chef, Gordon Ramsay, arrive at Joe's ranch because Joe wants to show him around first. Not a huge amount happens here, but the main thing we learn is that Joe has a friend called Skinny who's a goat. I'm not kidding. Kidding? Because he's a goat? Get it? I know, that's a terrible pun, let's move on. Anyway, what makes this bit even weirder is that Gordon says that Joe and Skinny are maybe a bit too close, and at one point Gordon asked Joe if he was going to kiss Skinny. So yeah, the less said about that the better. The episode then goes back to the normal format, and Gordon arrives at the restaurant and he loves the decor. Although he does comment that there is a fake fireplace on, even though it's 95 degrees outside, which is about 35 Celsius for anyone outside of America who doesn't use Fahrenheit. We then find out from the server, Amy, that Joe is actually the problem with the restaurant, which is hardly a shocker at this point, even though Gordon seems surprised by this. And Joe previously said that he didn't think of himself as being pretentious, but then Amy informs us that they're not allowed to use the word specials when referring to the menu.
Specials.
Features. We are told to use features as our descriptive word for what we have available that is not on the menu.
Which, I don't know, sounds pretty pretentious to me. Oh, and those features, by the way, will cost upwards of $29, which are some of the most expensive prices in the area. As usual, Gordon orders enough food to feed a small army, and Joe and Tom get to work in the kitchen. And there's yet another great example of the editors not letting Joe get away with his nonsense for even 1 second.
We do things with passion, with integrity. The food here at the bistro is the freshest, hands down.
Surely Joe must have been told to say some of this stuff because he's just walking into every reality TV trap that they lay for him at this point. Anyway, we then meet Bill, the server, who tells Gordon how arrogant Joe is and that he makes no effort to appeal to the locals. And just as a side note, the stone-cold look on Bill's face just completely gives me life. Gordon gets all of the servers to take their name badges off because they look ugly, and he's not wrong. And maybe it's just the inner graphic designer in me, but it irritates me that the name tags aren't even all in the same font or colour. But hey, what do I know? I'm still using Microsoft Paint at this point. Now comes my favourite part of every Kitchen Nightmares episode, which is when Gordon actually tastes the food. Which we all know he'll hate, and he'll probably use the words wow or bland about 50 times while showing us how gross the food is, but it's still highly enjoyable. First up is the onion soup, and as it's being served, Joe does what I think is supposed to be a British accent, which somehow ends up being worse than Dick Van Dyke in Mary Poppins.
I can hear him now.
Is the onion soup supposed to be so goddamn bloody good?
Well, not Royal Academy, I suppose. Still, they're better than a finger in the eye, ain't they?
And as you may have guessed, Gordon hates the soup and says that it isn't oniony enough for an onion soup, which seems like a fair critique, I guess. Next up is an oyster Rockefeller, which is covered in some green goop around the edges and frankly kind of looks like someone has projectile sneezed on the plate. And apparently it's a parsley infused oil which Joe, quote, squirts around the rim, which makes it sound like some kind of parsley toilet cleaner. Joe then comes out and Gordon tells him how horrible the oysters are and points out the parsley toilet cleaner stuff. And then there's a moment where Joe chuckles to himself in a way that I can only describe as slightly unhinged. And then comes what, in my opinion, is probably the best but most bizarre moment in the entire episode, which is when a waitress walks past with a piece of cake on a platter with flowers on it, because who doesn't put flowers on their cake tray, right? And Gordon jokes that it looks like a funeral procession, and he's not exactly wrong.
It's what you do when people are dead.
Do you want me to sing too?
Yeah.
He then gets up and they act as pallbearers for the cake and take it to the diner's table, who look as equally confused as I did watching this. I have no idea if this was Gordon's idea or whether he was told to do this bit, but please never change, Gordon, this was such television gold. And then we're back in the kitchen for another of Joe's Dick Van Dyke impressions.
What in the bloody are they putting carrots on it? A puff pastry, why would you do that?
And to be fair, as a British man myself, it does offend me to my core that Joe is putting some dirty looking raw carrots on top of pastry. We British people may not know much about food, but one thing we do know is that carrots and pastry do not belong on top of each other, let me tell you. And then comes another bombshell moment involving Joe when he's trying to tell Gordon how expensive those dumb looking micro carrots are, and Gordon tries to hand the carrots back to Joe.
Joe?
I mean, I don't personally want them.
But I guess Joe doesn't like being handed raw food and goes on a long rant about carrots.
Petite carrots. Carrots go to the white. Carrots go to the 5 seasons. Carrot was on as a garnish. Little petite carrots. Carrots.
Gordon then flips the lid of the scallop en croûte to reveal the contents, which can only be described as anemic baby food. And the pastry also looks about as appetizing as wet cardboard. Although Joe later says that the pastry is, quote, as flaky as you can get with 0 flakes coming off it. And all around good guy Tom says that it still looks a bit doughy, which Joe chooses to ignore. We then have a few other dishes such as an elk quesadilla, because, you know, nothing screams fine dining like a quesadilla. And Gordon says it's chewy anyway. There are also some gross oozing vegetarian ravioli, which look like they're in desperate need of some antibiotics.
Wow. I mean, that is a joke. I mean, it's ice cold. Let's get one thing right. Farm to table is not.
And Joe tries to blame this on the server for not bringing them out quick enough.
They were hot when they went out.
It took me 10 seconds to get from here to
I know.
there.
And you never know, maybe that's why they have a fake fireplace, because clearly the restaurant is so freezing that the food gets cold in the 30 seconds that it takes for the waitress to walk to the table.
Oh, come on.
And the final two courses are some catch of the day fish, which are somehow dry and greasy at the same time, and also even more elk, this time as medallions, with some more undersized vegetables as a garnish. And what is this guy's obsession with tiny vegetables?
There's little petite carrots.
And there are no prizes for guessing that Gordon is not impressed by any of this, and Joe says the word elk more times than I thought humanly possible.
That's aged elk. Elk is going to have a bite. That is a tender piece of elk. The bite of an elk. He has elk. An elk is tender. You make me elk. Elk, elk, elk.
Gordon then says he's leaving to go and get some actual food, which goes down swimmingly with Joe. And later Gordon returns for a showdown with Joe about lunch, much to the delight of the staff who look on with gleeful faces, and who can blame them. Gordon lays it all out for Joe and tells him how bad the food was, which goes down like a lead balloon. Or maybe an elk balloon would be more appropriate here.
Elk, elk, elk.
Joe admits that the fish is frozen, and apparently Joe needs to be told that catch of the day means that it's caught fresh and doesn't mean catch of the freezer. We then get yet another example of the editors completely setting Joe up when Joe says that he never claimed to be a chef.
You told me you trained with the best chefs in Europe.
I did f***ing tell you that. I'm self-taught by old school Europeans.
Gordon then delivers one of the most soul-crushing reality checks that I think I've ever heard.
Let me tell you something. You're not a fine dining bistro. You're a small man with a fake bistro.
And the servers are clearly living their best lives while they listen to Gordon ripping Joe a new one. And then in a strange twist, Joe tells Gordon that people say all the time that Joe is like Gordon's twin, so Gordon must also be a bad chef just like Joe. And I think Amy's face here sums up what we're all thinking. And Gordon then does the usual and definitely not scripted, infuriated walkout which we all know and love. Joe then goes on a rant to his staff and lays into them, dropping F-bombs like it's a battlefield. And what do you know, customers just so happen to walk in and overhear Joe shouting at his staff.
So I appreciate what you're doing.
And whichever producer set up this moment honestly needs a raise because they're doing the Lord's work at this point. Now getting into dinner service, and from what we've seen so far, you might think that Joe loves the sound of his own voice, but apparently there's a giant sign in the kitchen that says quiet. Advice that Joe should probably follow more often if he wants to avoid getting set up again by the editors. And this baffles Gordon, who questions how dinner service can function if the chefs aren't even allowed to talk to each other. And of course, Gordon, being the joker that he is, has to mess around with people a bit.
Oh, you okay?
Oh, I'm fine.
Jesus Christ, don't shout.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We then see many of the diners sending back food because it doesn't taste good, which does seem oddly suspicious, but maybe that's just me. I've read that other people from Kitchen Nightmares have claimed that the diners in the episodes are actually paid actors, and that's always in the back of my mind now. But if they really are actors though, they totally deserve a raise for their performances as grossed out customers number 1 and 2. Gordon then continues to bait Joe, presumably to try and give us some unmissable reality TV by systematically tearing down every part of Joe's personality.
Try to cook then. Passion. Passion fruit, mate. That's the closest you'll get to passion.
Gordon then gives an Oscar-worthy performance when he receives a definitely not premeditated phone call halfway through service and leaves, stating that it's part of his research. He then meets up with a former employee who is conveniently waiting outside the restaurant with a microphone pack on, and the two of them look around as if they're on a police stakeout. We find out that this lady previously worked in the kitchen, and Joe, surprise surprise, treated her badly, which caused her to quit.
It was being pretty much, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I'm doing much better now.
And she also shows some weird photos on her ancient looking phone of meat in plastic bags and some messed up looking vegetables. Which kind of makes me question what other photos she might have on her phone, but luckily we never find out. Gordon then goes back inside and does my second favourite thing on Kitchen Nightmares, which is when he goes through the fridges and freezers and usually ends up finding rotten food or, fingers crossed, some kind of dead rodent which will cause him to have a meltdown and shut the restaurant down. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen here. But one weird thing that Gordon does uncover is frozen blue cheese. Yeah, you heard that right.
What is that?
I also love that Gordon is just casually ripping open perfectly usable food and scattering it all over the floor while complaining about how unsanitary the kitchen is. Gordon then goes full postal on Joe and confronts him about the amount of frozen food, even though Joe earlier claimed that they are farm to fork.
I'm struggling here to stay in this building right now. I swear to God.
And let's be honest, these Gordon freakout moments are what we live for, and that's exactly why we love the show. Gordon also somehow spots a pot of French onion soup, which has now got some raw onions floating inside it, which Joe says he added because Gordon had said that it wasn't oniony enough before. And this leads to the big mother of all blowouts between the two men, where Gordon delivers even more soul-crushing insults than before.
That's called common sense. That in your tiny mind is not common.
And in true Kitchen Nightmares fashion, Gordon asks Joe if he wants him to leave. And just when the dramatic montage of facial expressions reaches its crescendo, we find out that it will be continued in part 2, of course. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see what Joe says. But spoiler alert, Joe says he wants Gordon to stay, otherwise, let's be honest, part 2 would be pretty short, wouldn't it?
Joe has been listening. I hope that he takes it well.
I'm asking for help.
Then wake up!
You wake up,
Idiot!
Anyway, that was part 1 of my review of the Mill Street Bistro episode of Kitchen Nightmares where they had a cake funeral. Let me know in the comments if you want me to do another of these videos for part 2, and also let me know what your favourite part of this episode was. If you'd like to get early access to my videos as well as exclusive content, you can become a member of my Patreon for just a few dollars a month and you'll unlock these amazing benefits. I'll put a link in the description. Please make sure you like, comment and share this video as it really helps support my channel. And of course, please make sure you hit the subscribe button to stay up to date about new uploads. Thanks for watching and I hope you'll join me again in future videos. Thank you, bye!